My name is Aubrey Hendrick, the hostess of Tales from the Round Table, and this is the podcast for anyone curious about the history behind the legends of King Arthur, the people who wrote them, and what those stories can still tell us today. Welcome to the table. Episode 1: Hype, Hoax, or History. Who was King Arthur? So we're just going to jump on in and answer the burning question you all are wondering. Was King Arthur even real? We're also going to discuss why it does or doesn't matter and what it has to say about the people who first wrote and heard these tales. To give a kind of brief breakdown of where we're going with this episode, I'm going to start with a couple of disclaimers. Then we're going to move into two early sources of the King Arthur mythology. Then we're going to transition into Arthur's place in Welsh sources, and finally, what this says about Arthur himself. So, I'm going to be honest with you. As you gathered from the episode title, this is an episode about whether or not a historical person by the name of Arthur ever actually existed. And I didn't want to start off this podcast by talking about that. Why? Because that's what everybody has done. And so I was like, this is gonna be ridiculously boring. But then I realized Arthuriana is called Arthuriana because it's named after this guy. We literally named the genre after him. He forms the crux of all of the stories, whether or not they're even about him or he actually even shows up in them. As a result, yeah, we're going to have to talk about this guy. So, here we are. To move into whether or not he was actually a real person, we're going to have to start by discussing the earliest Welsh sources. I'm sure a lot of y'all listening are probably familiar with this, but just in case you're not, the earliest Arthur tales are what we today would consider Welsh. At the time they were written, they would have been called Brittonic mythology, or the mythology of the Britons. That is, some of the earliest peoples to live on the Isle of Britain. As a side note, it is extremely important to note here that I don't mean English. Don't think England, think Britain, because there is a big distinction, and it's a huge can of worms that we're not going to go into in this episode. The important thing to get from this is that these Welsh stories are extremely old. In these stories, you find ancient figures such as Llywelyn Giffys and Manwydyn fab Llŷr. I'm sorry if I'm totally killing the Welsh, y'all. These are some important characters in a collection of these stories known as the Mabinogion and in some triads called the Welsh Triads. Now, the Mabinogion is old. It was first written somewhere in the 12th or 13th centuries. However, and this is really important, it is just the chronicling of much older oral tales. As a result, we aren't really sure how old these stories are. Some scholars argue that parts of the Mabinogion are pre-Christian, and Christianity is believed to have arrived in Britain somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd century. As a result, a lot of the characters that we know from Welsh mythology might even be BC, which is old. The Welsh Triads are in a very similar boat since they were also originally oral, but we really don't know how old they are. And that's the important thing to get out of this is we don't know, but we can guess that a lot of them are pretty old. So keep that in mind and we will circle back to that. Now that we've pretty extremely briefly discussed the world of Welsh mythology in which the earliest stories of Arthur exist, now we can shift to the character of Arthur himself. The character of Arthur is linked very extensively to the Saxon invasions of Britain, which occurred in the 5th century and, kind of wobbly around in that area. Arthur, in these earliest sources, is always linked to combat and fighting, And the primary people the Britons were fighting at this time were, you guessed it, the Saxons, Angles, and Utes. Now, here's where we have fun, because we can get to the burning question we're all wondering. Did Arthur, in fact, live in the 5th century? How do we know that he lived in the 5th century? What proof is there that he did live in the 5th century? The answer is, we don't know. There is, quite frankly, no hard proof. We have an insane amount of proof for the historical person of Jesus Christ. We have no real proof for any historical person by the name of King Arthur. If such is the case, how are we going to continue the episode from here? Well, we are going to dig into 2 sources that we do have, and the first of these sources is a Breton monk named Gildas. Gildas wrote something called De Excidio et Concusto Britanniae, somewhere around AD 547. Pardon my Latin. In this, he records the Battle of Mount Badon, which was a Breton victory over the Saxons, and he dates it somewhere to the late 5th century. He is writing from the mid-6th century, so we're doing decently well on the time here. In other words, roughly 60 years or so have passed, according to Gildas's writings, between the actual Battle of Mount Badon and when Gildas is writing this. However, if you have read this text, you're probably yelling at me right now because this work does not actually mention Arthur. Instead, it attributes this victory to a man by the name of Ambrosius Aurelianus, not Arthur. So why did I mention this source? Because later sources attribute this victory to Arthur, and this Ambrosius just kind of drops off the face of the earth. Various reasons why this could be, and we've changed it to attribute it to Arthur instead. Here's the 3 most likely, I think. First off, this could be because Arthur is our nice national hero, not Ambrosius. So it's just more fun to attribute it to Arthur than to Ambrosius. Secondly, Arthur and Ambrosius are 2 separate people, and both of them could have been present at this battle. Thirdly, and finally, Ambrosius Aurelianus could be Arthur's Latin name. Remember, Arthur is a Welsh name. It comes from the word arth, which means bear. And Gildas, if you can guess from the title of his work, is writing in Latin. So it is very possible that Arthur was in fact present at the Battle of Mount Badon, and Gildas is just writing about him using his Latin name. To mention an objection to this, the Annals Cambriae place Ambrosius in the Battle of Mount Badon happening later, and some scholars argue that another source, the Historia Britonum, places it even later, but it's not really agreed what the Historia Britonum is even saying. However, something to keep in mind here, the Historia Britonum was written circa the 8th century, while the Annals Cambriae was written in the 10th century, literally 500 years later, whereas Gildas was writing at most 100 years later. So I believe that Gildas's account is probably a little more reliable. Also, the Annals Cambriae is known to have some of its dates wrong, so there's that too. Therefore, at least until someone gives me a bit more solid objection, I'm gonna run with Gildas. As a result of all of this, it is definitely plausible that Arthur was present at the Battle of Mount Badon, whether he was Ambrosius or not. The second source, which is a lot more fun and conducive to my argument, is Gododdin. This was written sometime around AD 600, so once again we're doing good on the time if we believe that the Battle of Mount Badon and all of that was happening in AD 547. Also, unlike Gildas's account, this source was written in Welsh. It was written by a man named Aneurin. It is an elegy, meaning that it is memorializing dead Breton warriors who were killed in a battle against the Saxons at Catrith. Aneurin himself is a contemporary of these warriors. It is possible, and some scholars believe, that Aneurin fought alongside these men, owing to the mention of someone named Nairin being alongside these warriors at Catrith, being mentioned in Nennius and the Historian Brittonum. At the very least, Aneurin probably personally knew at least some of these individuals. Now, this poem has been added to, and we can tell because the language shifts. For example, think about the Declaration of Independence versus modern English. If somebody added to the Declaration of Independence writing in our modern dialect, you could tell pretty stinking well. However, the part that I'm about to mention was not added, and we can tell because it uses a more archaic language style. This segment that I'm about to read is about a warrior named Arthur and his prowess in battle and kind strength as a leader. The foe's greatest opponent struck the host of 300. He cut men down both in the center and at the far flank. The generous hero's acts were exemplary to the company, for he shared gifts and rewards of horses in the winter. A great warrior. He fed black ravens on the rampart of the fortress, though he was no Arthur. The interesting part of this is, though he was no Arthur. Why in the world is this Arthur being mentioned, particularly when Arthur has never been mentioned anywhere else? Because Aneurin is writing only 100 to 150 years after when Arthur would have lived, it is extremely likely that he is referencing a real historical person that was known as a war hero against the Saxons. Aneurin wouldn't have needed to tell the reader more about Arthur because the reader would have already known, as only a generation or two at the most have passed between Aneurin's writings and when Arthur would have lived. It is extremely likely that oral traditions of Arthur would have already circulated by this time. As a great warrior, great enough to be compared to other warriors and well known enough by Aneurin's readers/listeners, he would not have needed an introduction to his earliest audience. Remember how I said we would come back to those old Welsh stories? Well, now we do. This is where something fun and wild happens. Remember those old heroes that I mentioned, Llwla Gyffes and Manawydan fab Llŷr? Slowly, over time, Arthur comes to be compared to these heroes in sources like the Welsh triads. For example, 3 Red Reapers of the Isle of Britain, Hrun son of Beli, Llwla Gyffes, and Morgaunt the Wealthy. But one was more of a Red Reaper than the 3. Arthur was his name. For a year, neither grass nor plants came up where one of the 3 walked. But for 7 years, none would come up where Arthur walked. We don't know when the triads were written, but according to my source, it was before the 9th through 10th century. Some of the triads are older than others, and some are ridiculously old, as we've already established. This shows us how Arthur slowly moved from being a real historical leader like George Washington and grew to be absorbed into the mythologies of his own people, coming to be associated with the very heroes and legends that he himself would have likely grown up hearing as a kid. A good example of what's happening here for a more modern audience is think about Star Wars. We have the original Star Wars trilogy with Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, Han Solo, that a lot of our parents grew up watching, and we grew up watching, but by the time we watched them, they were, 30 years, 50 years old. And then we have the prequel trilogy, which takes the characters that we're already familiar with, gives them more of a fleshed out backstory, and then we have the sequel trilogy, if we decide to count it as actually existing, which once again expands upon the characters that already existed and adds more characters, adds more stories, adds to the lore. That's basically what's happening with these Arthur stories. You have the oldest tales about these characters, about these heroes, about Arthur. And as time goes on, people play in this world. They add to the world, they add to the mythology, and they create something new. Just like what people have done with the Clone Wars, or with the Star Wars video games, or with the comics. So when you think about this, think about Star Wars. So, after all of this, where does this bring us in our conversation about Arthur? First off, if you didn't gather from this, I believe that Arthur was, in fact, a real person. However, if you disagree with me, it's honestly no big deal. There's really almost no proof, all things considered. If you have other sources that make you believe he wasn't real, please do reach out and let me know, because I'd love to know what you think. And who knows, you might even convince me I'm wrong, and then I'll do an episode talking about that. Secondly, Arthur was not a king in the way that we think of him. He was probably just a warrior. At most, he was a chieftain of some kind, but he definitely was not the nice shiny king that we think of. So in that way, no, King Arthur was not real. But someone by the name of Arthur, who eventually morphed into that, I think was. Thirdly, and this is controversial, but I don't believe that Arthur was a Roman, since he doesn't show up in Latin sources until much later. If he was Ambrosius, then I think that was more of his Roman title, not his actual name. But once again, I could be wrong. Honestly, the biggest thing that I want us to get from this entire podcast is, what does this say about the people who would have heard those earliest Arthur stories? Who were they? What was important to them? What were their worlds like? Well, they were scared. Their world was changing crazy fast. They had lost the last vestiges of Roman control, which they believed kept them safe. They were being invaded by the Saxons, Angles, and Utes, who were most likely pretty hostile. Many of these people probably lost loved ones and became displaced. And that, I think, is why Arthur's stories are so enduring. They touch on so many emotions that real humans face. That's why we're still telling stories about this guy who was mentioned in a one-off line 1,500 years ago. Aneurin wanted his people to be remembered. He wrote that elegy because he had lost friends and his world was being turned upside down. He wanted his old life and the warriors who had fought for his people to be remembered. And he did that by comparing them to this great warrior who had also fought for his people. And now here we are, all these years later, remembering Aneurin and his people as a result of this guy named Arthur, just as Aneurin would have wanted. And I think that's pretty cool. So regardless of whether or not you believe that Arthur is a real person, whether or not he even is a real person, ultimately it doesn't matter. He's touched so many people's lives, and the stories that he's been a part of have given people from wildly different cultures a voice. From Geoffrey of Monmouth's The History of the Kings of Britain and Marie de France's Landval, to T.H. White's Once and Future King and Tracy Dion's The Legend-Born cycle, Arthuriana and writing and reading tales about King Arthur have given people a space to discuss their own worlds, their own fears, and their own hopes. And that, I think, is the most important part of any Arthur story. I'm Aubrey Hendrick, and you've been listening to Tales from the Round Table. See you again in a couple weeks. Thanks so much for hopping in and listening to my podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me on the Contact Me form on my website, aubreyhendrick.com. If you're curious about any of the research that I used in putting together this episode, then you can also find that information on the website as well on the podcast page. Also, I am super aware that I probably murdered the Welsh and Latin pronunciations, so if you have any tips on that, please feel free to let me know. I'd like to wrap up this episode by giving a huge shout out to everyone who's helped me get this podcast off the ground. Thank you to Dave Jackson of the School of Podcasting podcast for giving tips on how to start a great podcast. Thank you, Thomas Umstadt Jr. of Author Media for giving me a great book on podcasting. And a huge shout out to Zach Russell of Lorehaven Podcast for answering my many, many questions. I would also like to thank Dr. Britt Mize of Texas A&M University for setting me off on the right foot in all of my Arthurian research. And finally, that music you hear is not AI, y'all. I want to wrap up by thanking my awesome best friend Phoebe for composing and recording all of the music you hear in this episode. You're the best, Phoebster. Well, that's it for me, y'all. See y'all next time.